Hey there, welcome back to Podcast and Amplify. Today is a special episode that we're recording. I have invited Manisha Tare back to the show. She was on the show, was it season 2? She does really great work, but I'm going to let her tell you about the kind of work that she does. But first, I want to lay a little bit of groundwork or just give some insight or context for having this conversation. So, if you've listened to Podcast and Amplify, you will have heard a previous episode where I spoke with Denise Johnson about communication tools when having difficult conversations. And I was really excited to have that conversation with her because she is so knowledgeable, and we had a great conversation around these strategies, these tools for navigating those kinds of conversations, having a win-win sort of attitude, and sometimes being okay with just walking away. It was really fantastic. So if you haven't listened to that episode, please go back and listen. But when I was speaking with Venice, she had mentioned incident, or she had shared a story where she had to go back and apologize to someone because she didn't show up how she really wanted to show up. And I told her when we were talking, I said, that's like really brave. And you have to be really vulnerable to do that. And she was like, yeah, it's part of doing that self work. And she really made me realize that there's the communication part, but then there's the other side where we have to do that pre-work. We have to do that inner work so that we can show up curious, open-minded, vulnerable, because those are the things that really facilitate great conversation, especially when it's tough. So I immediately thought of Manisha because of her work, and she's been on the show before. And so I thought, what a great compliment to the previous episode that hopefully you've listened to. Come in and talk about how we can take care of ourselves, get to that place and do that inner work. Welcome, Manisha, to the show. Welcome back. And please share with us your focus and what you do.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love that you just shared the progression, and I love to get into the conversation that we had with your audience. But just back up, my work is around somatic healing. So I work with embodiment. I do a combination of coaching and somatic healing work with my clients. I work with highly sensitive, mostly women, but certainly some men as well. And what I really do is help them identify some of the underlying root causes of the people pleasing and the overgiving and avoiding conflict and all of these types of things that make it really difficult for them to set boundaries in relationships. Because as someone who is sensitive, a feeler, an empath, like you're feeling everybody else's stuff. And so it can be really difficult to set those boundaries because you don't want to hurt people's feelings. Like you don't want them to feel alone. You don't want them to experience like some of the rejection or abandonment that perhaps you have experienced. So when we can get to some of the root issues through the approach I use is trauma-informed somatic work, we can really start to reset, heal the nervous system. And so it essentially significantly diminishes or decreases those coping skills of the people pleasing or the conflict avoidance and all of that kind of stuff, because you no longer have the same charge around those early experiences that we might have forgotten, we might have repressed. We put them in a back pocket somewhere and forgot. And just to add to that, doesn't mean you have to go relive every single experience that you've had at all. However, those feelings can, and the energy of those feelings can sit in our body. And so when we do some of this work where we tune into the body, what we're really doing is giving space for some of those feelings to rise up and leave and shift and be acknowledged. So just to be clear, like this doesn't mean you have to relive all of these difficult things you've experienced, but you might have to be brave and re-feel some of the feelings in order to let them go so that you can be in this more like neutral, open space of feeling safe to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and it's creating that safety that's really challenging. And it is something that I think is really good when you can have support around it because there are a lot of things that come up. But yeah, your work with somatic work, working with being trauma informed, relationships are such a part of what you do. And
Mhm.
really, that's what communication is about, right? We're
Mhm.
trying to
Yeah.
foster relationships with other people. And a lot of that can be triggering, especially
Absolutely.
if we're like, I'm not comfortable in
Mhm.
this, setting this boundary or even speaking my truth, using my voice.
Yeah.
So I'm so excited to have you here to help us unpack that a little bit and give us maybe some just like awareness and maybe even
Mhm.
some tools to use. But I want to take a little step back and ask you about what's a pivotal moment that got you to this place? It's my question I'm
Mm.
asking every guest this season. And I think it's good to bring in a little bit of everyone's story. That way we can
Yeah.
understand you a little bit better.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you were saying it, I thought, oh my gosh, there's so many things layered on top of each other. But I would say if I had to choose something, I had, I'm trying to think of the time frame, but I had an injury. And this is so random because we're talking about boundaries and relationships and all these things, but I had a shoulder injury that seemed to come out of nowhere. And I was like, what's happening to my body? Like, I'm relatively young. I am a yoga teacher. Like, I'm active. Like, this should not be a thing. And anyway, it turned out to be a frozen shoulder. And in that moment, I was in pain. I clearly couldn't teach yoga in the same way that I was teaching before. I was actually working with kids at the time as an occupational therapist. I couldn't lift them. Like, it was kind of a mess. And so I was just like trying to find and seek all of these different things around like, how can I, first of all, how did this happen? And then secondly, like, how can I fix this essentially? And I went initially like the physical route, but then I started getting more into acupuncture. And that's when I learned about craniosacral therapy, which I ended up training and practicing for many years. And why that's a pivotal moment is because I started to really make the link between all of the experiences that I had suppressed and that were like stuck in my body. Because what I was learning through acupuncture and some of the other energetic work was all of these like energy channels are connected. And I was like having this physical manifestation basically of this like emotional experiences or early experiences that I had never really processed or healed. And so that's really what helped me like recognize just the holistic nature of our bodies. And there certainly absolutely was a physical component. I went to physical therapy, like they were so helpful. So I'd never have like, yeah, do that. And for me, I also, because I have this sensitive nervous system, had to find these other modalities. And when I started to dig a little bit deeper, I just realized, oh yeah, I am sensitive. And oh, I never really learned how to process my really big feelings. And of course, they overwhelmed me, so I shoved them down. And okay, like now my body's just being like, yep, we're done holding them for you. Like you have to deal with them now. And so I went on this journey of understanding like, how do I process my emotions? Like, how do I work with my body? How do I get in tune with all of that? And it was really impacting my relationships because I would feel reactive and overwhelmed and like easily triggered and like all of these things. And yeah, so it was all like meshing in together. So this was really a moment where I had to stop and figure a lot of stuff out that I hadn't really paid much attention to.
And isn't it funny how, our bodies will tell us if we're not listening, right? It's okay. Now it's going to go to a physical
Yep.
manifestation that you cannot ignore. You can't ignore me anymore. And
Yes.
you're so right. Like our bodies, it's never just one thing. I think
Mm,
in a lot of things in life, it's never one thing, but our bodies are
mhm,
so complex. And I could see how it's not just the physical, it's the emotional, it's the mental, and it all works together and it's interwoven and integrated. And it takes us paying attention first. And I can definitely see how that connects to leading you down this path that you're currently on
mhm.
and how you help people. So when it comes to conversations, when we're having these difficult conversations, what are the kinds of things that influence how we show up?
Yeah, so I would say certainly our past experiences, right? Because they really are the lens through which we're perceiving life, and like literally all of our experience until then. You and I could hear the same exact thing and we would perceive it differently. And then if you think about somebody, and I think we probably have maybe a more similar way of perceiving things, generally speaking, just because we are both sensitive and introverted and all of that. But like then you take a person who is not, maybe it's not highly sensitive or an extrovert or something else, then the perception is so different. Certainly our experiences, I think that if we are our personal relationship, certainly with the person that we're talking to, even things like that have happened to us throughout that day can lead us to be in a different state. And so, just as an aside, sometimes when I'm talking to clients, I'll say, when are you having this conversation? Are you having this conversation at the end of a long week? Like when you and your partner maybe are like really burnt out and exhausted, or are you having it like after you've gotten a good night's sleep, like can both focus? Like these physiological things are really important. When we just live in a society that's people are running around, they're busy, we're on our phones, we're doing a lot, we're holding a lot. The world is a lot right now. And so I just think we can't live in a vacuum to say those things aren't going to impact us. So I think even when we're having conversations, like we can think about how can we set ourselves up to have them at a time and space where we can be like our most optimal selves.
Yeah, so definitely our experience, our perspectives, and I like that you bring up the physiological part too. Of course, it's all important, and yeah, paying attention to like, what's going on in your surroundings. And then when it comes to how we are, like, I guess if we shift internally, how can we become more self-aware around knowing what our energy is in the moment? What kinds of things trigger us when we're having these difficult conversations? You mentioned it could be hard for some people to set boundaries, or it can be hard for people to just even engage and not avoid
Mm.
having the difficult conversation.
Yeah, I think there is such a range. Like I would imagine people listening to your podcast have a reasonable level of self-awareness, like where they're tuned into kind of personal development, different things like that. So we'll start there and just say, for somebody who has some of those recognitions, can you start to notice when you're having a reaction? Can you put any patterns together? Is it always around the same person? Is it around the same types of people? Is it around the same time of day? And what is that reaction? Do you notice that you shut down? If we think about maybe like trauma responses or coping mechanisms, are you a person that maybe shuts down when something gets difficult or stresses you out? Do you fight back? Do you feel this need to just say yes and avoid conflict? Like starting to get to know, what do I have a go to? Do I do all of them at different times depending on how I'm feeling? So you can start to notice. And if somebody's really like, oh, this is really like, how do I do this? Start writing it down, because it's hard to remember all of these things. So if you're just like feeling a little anxious, start a little notebook, be like, I feel anxious and it's this time of day and maybe this happened. Or you're noticing, oh, I notice that I feel anxious like before I have to have this kind of conversation, before I have to say no to somebody, or before I think I might disappoint somebody or upset them, or before I talk to my mom, or before I talk to my spouse. Or we can start to recognize like these types of things. And then if maybe you're not so much, or you're getting into the personal development space and you're not like super in tune just yet, you might start to notice like, do I make everything like about somebody else? Is everything like because someone else is doing it wrong? Yeah, certainly that's the case sometimes, right? I'm not going to say that's not. But if it's like all the time, you're like, there's probably something there that we have to look at, right? So I would look for glaring patterns like that, like all or nothing. Is it really, yeah, just everything is this, or all these people are this way and I'm this way? Like we can start to notice like when we're using that language. And then again, if you've been on this little path for a while, you can start to really delineate who is this with and does my stomach hurt, or does my throat close, or do I just want to run away, or do I avoid things? And I remember I had was working with somebody who she just didn't want to disappoint somebody, so she basically wouldn't give them the answer, and this was like her partner, and they were just like, just tell me, is it yes or no? It's fine, like you don't it's but for her, there was so much anxiety and even like maybe saying no, even if she knew her partner was like 100% okay with it. So she would just avoid it. And then it would actually become a fight because the response would be so delayed that it would create like a ripple effect because of a schedule or timing or something can get done. And so notice like if your avoidance is like creating other problems, like outside of just your internal set. Does that like make
Yeah,
sense?
that
Okay.
makes a lot of sense. And that example that you gave very it very much highlights how you have to do that inner work because her partner was giving her all the safety that he could possibly give her, and it didn't matter because she didn't have that for herself. So that's a
Oh,
great example. Yeah.
so sad. Yeah. It's like she didn't feel comfortable, even though the external person was offering that. And that's really interesting. And yeah, can open up like a whole different lens. I think that's interesting because so often we're like looking for validation from the outside, but sometimes even when we get it, it doesn't feel like enough. And so I think that, okay, when I'm like, that's not enough coming from the outside, that's like such a marker indicator, I think, to notice to be like, wow, like I really need to shore this up internally because I'm
Yes.
literally getting the confirmation from the outside and it still doesn't feel okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's the perfect example for this conversation because I wanted to have this because I was thinking about all the tools that I was getting from Venice and they were fantastic. And I definitely love having language and having a script and having
Mhm.
methods and just like we were saying earlier about it, like not just being physical and not just being emotional or mental, like communication is so complex. You need all of it.